Hi everyone, it's David from Automotive Press. As you guys know, I was born and raised in Japan, and so I do love cars that are built in Japan, or at least engineered in Japan. But many Japanese cars are now built in many different places, not just Japan, but obviously US, Canada, Mexico, Europe, other parts of Asia, you name it, they're built in many different places. So the big question is, are the cars that are engineered and built in Japan still better than those that are built somewhere else outside Japan? Well, this is a controversial topic, and some people will be arguing with me forever. And I know that some cars are actually better built in North America than in Japan. So it's not that everything's always better in Japan. However, if you go one step at a time and go through all the different characteristics and attributes as an engineer, you still find many advantages when you buy cars that are built in Japan. Like this one here, 2025 Mitsubishi Outlander, all refreshed, and in many cases kind of re-engineered for 2025, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. But there are definitely advantages. In fact, I'm going to give you 10 reasons why you may want to buy cars that are built in Japan, like this one. Let's go. Welcome back. So are there really advantages in buying cars that are built in Japan? I still do think so, even though there are many cars that are built in Canada, US, and Mexico, or elsewhere that may be as good or sometimes better than those built in Japan. If you look at the whole thing from a holistic perspective and look at all the different attributes, you will still find many advantages in buying cars that are built in Japan, like this one right here, which is again a refreshed 2025 Mitsubishi Outlander. And I'm going to give you 10 specific reasons, and you'll see that the Outlander actually fits into all those 10 different factors or 10 characteristics. And the first one is an important one for me because I practice this a lot in my work, and that is the word Kaizen, which means continuous improvement in Japanese. But it's more than just continuous improvement or process improvement. It's also about making sure that you get a feedback from customers, from suppliers, from engineering, and making sure that the changes are meaningful, that the improvements actually make a difference when you drive a car or when you own a car. And these kind of very important Kaizen activities or Kaizen improvements are what makes these Japanese brands really stand apart, because they focus so much on Kaizen that they keep getting better and better and better. So let me, for example, use this Outlander as an example. Well, when this car first came out a few years ago, I loved the car overall, but I told the chief engineer, Mr. Honda or Honda-san, that the only thing I wasn't happy with was the fact that steering was too light and had no feeling at all. In fact, I said the steering is just numb, there's no connection with the road, and I feel like I'm driving a car that's just, basically void of all kind of a driving enjoyment. Everything else was great, almost perfect. So I said to Mr. Honda, please, whatever you can do to improve the steering and the driving characteristic, that would be really appreciated, because the car is so amazing in many other ways. And you know what? That Kaizen advice or Kaizen feedback from me and many other customers were taken very seriously, to the point where this car drives nothing like the 2024 and prior pre-facelift Outlander. The improvements to the steering, the improvements in terms of steering characteristic, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later on, is dramatic. This thing drives a lot more like a real fun to drive SUV, getting closer and closer to where Mazda and BMW and Porsche are. Those cars are actually worth driving, it's fun to drive, and this is not too far from some of those benchmarks. In fact, I would even say this Outlander's driving characteristic and driving feel in terms of steering is better than anything else in this price range. It's that much better, and that is the mentality of a Kaizen, which is to take into account feedback and making things better and better, not just on a surface, but something that actually translates to real meaningful improvements. And that's what they did. And I'll talk about that a little bit more on the road, but that's the first reason why buying cars that are built in Japan and or engineered in Japan are meaningful, because they really take the word Kaizen seriously, and the Kaizen activities or process improvement activities are built in throughout the whole process. And every engineer, every manufacturing people, designers, they're all involved in that, and they're constantly trying to make something better. And you'll see hundreds of improvements in this Outlander for 2025, and that is very much part of a Kaizen process. And that's the first reason why buying cars that are engineered and built in Japan have advantages, because in other countries they do Kaizen, but not to the same extent the Japanese do. The second reason why cars that are built in Japan may have advantages, not always, but oftentimes, is obviously the quality. And that word quality could mean many different things to many people, but I measure quality based on exterior panels, as you know, the panel gap, the paint check, and also interior. So I'm going to do that for you and show you that this Outlander, which is built in Japan, shows that classic Japanese attention to detail and therefore the resulting quality. Now, I know that this is controversial because there are many cars that are built in North America, especially Canadian factories, that do really well in the quality check, and sometimes they're better than the cars built in Japan. So I'm not saying as a blanket statement every car that are built in Japan are better, but if you look at the collective data overall, the cars that are built in Japan tend to do better in terms of quality, in terms of reliability, and so forth. So there are some differences, and I'll show you what I mean by that by looking at this refreshed 2025 Mitsubishi Outlander. You can see the gaps are very consistent, about 3.5 millimeter all the way through. So if you recall, most cars are between 3 to 5 millimeters. Most Toyotas are about 3.5 to 4 millimeters. Some Lexuses are closer to 3 millimeters. And many other cars are ranging from 4.5 to 5 millimeters. So anything 3.5 millimeter and lower I consider to be very good. And also it's not just a gap width, but also consistency. So you can kind of run your finger here and notice that everything lines up really well. The plastic components line up here well as well. And in the doors are about 3.7 millimeter, 3.6 millimeter, and actually 3.2 millimeters. So gaps are really narrow between the fenders and the doors, and again, very consistent, especially considering this is kind of early production models. And as you can tell, the Mitsubishi have many different creases and they all line up, which is always hard to do. So in terms of exterior panel, so far looks really impressive. I'll do a paint thickness gauge as well right now, but I want to show you the quality of most Japanese cars built in Japan are typically better than cars that are built somewhere else. Again, I'll make some exception because I'm a little bit biased being from Japan and also from Canada, that Canadian factories produce some of the best quality, especially from Toyota. But if you take everything into account, cars that are built in Japan, generally speaking, perform better when I do this kind of quality check and audits. So let's do a quick paint check and then we'll check the inside as well. By the way, this paint is a new paint for the Outlander called the Moonstone Gray. It's a beautiful color that kind of looks grayish, bluish, so forth. I love the color, but you're going to be shocked when I measure the paint thickness because it's way thicker than your average car. So this is in micron right now, and so I'm going to start with the hood first. That's 177 microns. You usually want the paint to be between 100 to 150 microns. Thicker the better because it just means it's more durable. But most Japanese cars, including Toyotas, are only about 100 to 110, maybe 120 microns. But you're already going to find that these paints are much thicker. 164 front fender, front door 165, rear door 143, so very consistent. And rear fender is 173, so you're kind of ranging 150, 160, 170 microns. And that is good 30-40%, maybe even 50% thicker than many other manufacturers' paint jobs. So this is an amazing thickness that you only find in some really high-end European cars, and that's what you're finding right here in the Mitsubishi Outlander, maybe partly because of this new special paint, but the paint thickness is way thicker than your Toyota cars, actually even thicker than most Lexus cars, which are around 150 microns. So I'm very impressed with the thickness. Let's take a look inside the car now. So I'm inside the Outlander now, and this brings me to the third point of the reasons why you might want to buy cars built in Japan, and that is the component quality is also better than cars that are built somewhere else. So what I mean by that is that it's not just the exterior body panels, but also things that are made by suppliers, everything from the dash, the seats, to instrumentation. These are all built by suppliers, not built by the OEMs or original equipment manufacturer, and therefore it's important that the suppliers are also following through with the Kaizen and also process improvement and making sure that their quality is right up there with some of the best in the world. And you'll see that the Japanese built cars often have a really good component quality because their suppliers have been around for a very long time, and they have been working together with automakers for a long time, and they build up this experience and this craftsmanship over time that sometimes you don't get it in other parts of the world. So if you were to look at this Outlander in terms of the dash, it's a soft material here. You get beautiful stitching here as well. And if you look at each of the components, I can't find like gaps. I can't really put anything in between the components because it's tightly put together, and there's nothing defective. Everything lines up. The materials feel good. Even the doors look good. And the selection of the materials and the texture of these plastics are best in the world. My frustration with cars that are built in North America or somewhere else in the world are often the quality of the materials in terms of plastic. Sometimes they look too shiny, sometimes they look cheap, and that's a common issue with many cars actually these days. But you can tell in this Outlander, everything looks high-end and well-made, and that's because these suppliers that make the dash, that make the components, have a long-standing history with these automakers, and they've been around for a long time. So experienced engineers and experienced manufacturing people are engineering and building these things, and you can really see that difference. So that's another reason why oftentimes cars that are built in Japan have a really good quality inside. They look good, they feel good, and they're also put together really well. By the way, I did end up measuring the thickness of the glass here at the front, and it is 5.8 millimeters approximately. So this glass is definitely acoustic, and you can see that it has a lamination, is sandwiched between the two glasses. So it is an acoustic glass here in the front, which makes the vehicle even quieter. And in the back, it is 4 millimeters. So it is a normal glass. That's usually the case. So the front glass is a sandwich acoustic glass to give you a quieter sound, and the back one is a normal glass. So are there more reasons why you should consider buying cars that are built in Japan? Well, the fourth reason is long-term reliability. Now, not all Japanese brands do well, and not all Japanese brands prove to be reliable. But generally speaking, if you compare kind of brand by brand from different countries, the Japanese automakers, especially those built in Japan, tend to do well. So for example, you can look at the Consumer Report or JD Power Survey, and you'll begin to see some pattern in terms of analytics. If you look at the JD Power's dependability studies, which looks at the last 3 years of ownership of a car, Mitsubishi actually beat out Toyota in 2023. In fact, that year, Lexus was number one, and then Mitsubishi was the second Japanese automaker in that top 10 list. And then followed by Toyota right behind Mitsubishi, and all the rest were quite a bit lower than Mitsubishi. But now, for some reason, 2024 dependability study that came recently did not have Mitsubishi, and my understanding is that they didn't get enough data to support the actual report. So it didn't show up in that particular report. But as I said, this particular model, the Outlander, did really well in that report, and specifically as a brand, Mitsubishi was in top 10 above Toyota. So definitely the thing is well built, well engineered, and it shows up. But generally speaking, if you were to look at all the cars that are built in Japan, especially those that are engineered in Japan as well, they tend to have a really good long-term reliability. There's no question that there is some differences among cars built in Japan compared to those built somewhere else. So that's the fourth reason. The fifth reason why you might want to buy cars that are built in Japan, especially if it's also engineered in Japan, is the fact that engineers in Japan, they're like an exceptional talent. In Japan, people love engineers. It's considered one of the best career to go into, and therefore they're highly respected, and they also tend to stay in the same company for a very long time, which means if someone is designing or engineering a powertrain, well, they're a powertrain specialist, and they stay that way perhaps for their entire career. Or if they're maybe a body specialist that design body and panels, again, they become so good at it, they stay in that field. Whereas in Western world, the engineers move around a lot. In fact, the car companies often encourage these engineers to move around from designing engine to maybe suspension to transmission. So sometimes their expertise do not stay in that particular field, because in Western world, people are encouraged to move around and then move up by having a kind of wider spectrum of experience. Whereas in Asia, especially in Japan, they want you to become a specialist and stay in that field so that you can be the best engineer in that particular component. And those kind of experiences show up in terms of long-term reliability, in terms of kind of minute and subtle differences in the feel of the car. And you can really tell the Japanese engineers take pride of the work they do. And I should know that because I worked for a Japanese company, for a US car company, for a Canadian car company, and I worked in all three countries, Japan, US, and Canada. And I visited almost every factory in many parts of the world. And I can tell you that the attitudes of the Japanese engineers are very different from many other countries. So this gives me some additional confidence that if the car is built in Japan, engineered in Japan, I know that they were looked after and designed by people who stayed in that field for a very long time. What else can I tell you? Well, the sixth reason is the fact that Japanese engineers and designers spend a lot of time in terms of attention to details. I already pointed out some of the things I'm seeing inside this vehicle, including the stitching, details of all this fit and finish, how the materials work really well. So those are some telltale signs. But also when you get deeper and deeper, you notice the difference in terms of how much time and effort they place in making sure that everything is perfect. So in the case of this new Mitsubishi Outlander, they've completely revamped the whole stereo system. It's now a Yamaha system as opposed to Bose system. And there are two types of Yamaha system, the base model, which is already very good, and this one called the Ultimate, which is just absolutely fantastic, perhaps the best stereo system I've heard in cars at this price range. And I listened to almost an hour worth of presentation by one of the engineers from Yamaha that explained all the details in terms of how they came up with this new stereo system. And no details were spared. Everything from the shape of the grille, this looks beautiful right here, but also in terms of the selection of speakers, the amplifiers, in terms of sound profile. They wanted to make sure that the new Yamaha system sounds like you are in a concert in front of the artist. They want to replicate that feel in the car. And I can tell you based on my experience so far, listening to their stereo system, you know what? I think they achieved it, because when I'm listening to the system, I feel like I'm in a concert hall and it's just a fantastic sound. You have to hear it to believe it. But they even reinforced the doors so that the speakers in the door do not vibrate too much, and that the speaker themselves can act as a speaker box. And they also redesigned many parts of the interior so the entire car acoustic works well with this stereo system, and that the body itself can also act as a speaker box, providing that very rich, very high profile sound to the music that you're listening to. And again, you probably know this already, but many cars suffer from what I call the door vibration problem. When you crank up the stereo a little bit, the speakers in the door vibrate, and you hear that sound, like this kind of loose sound. And you don't hear that in Outlander because they reinforced the doors. They added some structural changes to it and some padding throughout the car as well. So even if you crank up the volume, it's got a lot of bass, it sounds perfect. There's no echo, there's no vibration, and the stereo system is clean, it's easy to use. It's got a different profile you can load up in terms of the feeling. You can also change the mode so that it's only for driver, for the passenger, or in the rear. Many different configurations to play with, but that level of attention to details is not something I see from many other automakers, especially if the engineers are not from Japan. And I know I'm going to sound biased here because I'm from Japan, but I went to engineering in the Western world. I went to engineering in Vancouver and also in Boston from MIT. And there's nothing wrong with engineers, regardless where they're located. They're all smart. But this attention to details and getting all the little nitty-gritty done correctly, well, that's a Japanese trait. And if you go to Japan, visit Japan, you'll know what I mean. But they love having attention to details and making sure everything looks right, everything feels right. And so that's a very important factor. Seventh reason is something that's a little bit hard to explain unless you actually worked as an engineer in Japan and elsewhere, and you'll know the difference. But as you know, I worked as an engineer in Japan with a number of Japanese companies. I also worked as an engineer in the US and also Canada. And I've gone on many, many trips to other countries working with other engineers. And one of the key differences in terms of approach to creating something like this Outlander is what I call the collaborative engineering. Sometimes we call it synchronous engineering. And many car companies attempt to do the same thing, where you bring together the manufacturing engineers, design engineers, component suppliers, testing engineers, all the different groups of engineering and designers are brought together to work together as a single team to create something amazing. And that collaborative approach is really the heartbeat of Japanese thinking, Japanese engineering, and Japanese development. And even though many automakers try to replicate that collaborative approach, they just can't seem to do it the same way. And partly because of the mindset of the Japanese, partly because as a kid growing up, we're all told to work together as a team, partly because in Japan, we're rewarded as a team as opposed to rewarded as an individual. And so we automatically try to work together as a team in a collaborative, in collective fashion. And that approach are unique to engineers and manufacturing people in Japan. And I think no one can quite replicate that. And that shows through in the overall feel of a car when they actually finish developing it. So in the case of this Outlander, the feel of the driving, the tightness, the ride, the quietness, the refinement, all that is actually pretty outstanding. And this Outlander is one of the best SUVs now in the market. I might even say that in this price range, this is the most balanced and the best value and the best engineered car, period. If you're looking at the bigger SUVs, I would still say the Mazda with their CX-70 and 90s are really, really good and the benchmark. But the Outlander competes in a slightly different class from the CX-70 and CX-90. It competes more with Toyota RAV4 and the regular Toyota Highlander, not the Grand Highlander, and also Honda CR-V and so forth. This one does have 3 rows of seats, so a little bit different from those vehicles. But in this class, there's really no one else that have engineered a vehicle to this perfection. I can really see that refinement, and that is because of the collaborative approach by the Japanese engineers. And you know what? That is something that's unique to Japan. So I've given you 7 reasons why there are some advantages to buying cars that are built in Japan. Are there more? Well, I'm going to give you a few more. The 8th one is the fact that there are better loop cycles in terms of getting feedback from the consumers and dealers back to the engineers in Japan to improve the product. That feedback cycle is faster and more effective and taken more seriously in Japan, mainly because the Kaizen mentality actually goes throughout Japan, not just in terms of manufacturing or engineering, but Japanese people in general think that way. They think like Kaizen ever since they're kids, where they're taught to improve, they're taught to self-reflect and keep making things better, including themselves. And so therefore, the feedback is welcome. And oftentimes what you'll find is that the dealers get some feedback from the consumers and or consumers give direct feedback to the car companies. But either way, there is this cycle that goes back and forth. There's a loop. And that allows the engineers and manufacturing people and designers on the automaker side to receive this in a timely fashion so that they can make those improvements and therefore provide a better product down the road. And I find that cycle, it takes a little bit longer in the Western world, but shorter and more precise and more accurate in Japan. And again, I should know that because I worked in all these different countries. So as an example, this Mitsubishi Outlander for 2025 have received many hundreds of little improvements that are directly the result of feedback from the dealers and customers and owners. And that have resulted in this Outlander feeling quite different to the 2024 and prior version. I always liked the Outlander. I always stand by the fact that it was a really well-engineered vehicle because I love the all-wheel drive system. But this thing is the best iteration ever. And in fact, it may be the best affordable SUV in this price range. And that is because the refinement process is so much better. Like I said before, the driving character of the steering, the feedback into my hands, the suspension changes, the ride, are all designed to give you that refinement feel that are often lacking in other cars. So even though this Outlander is called refresh, which means that it should be mostly minor changes, I actually think that the changes are substantially more than a normal refresh, and I would call this kind of medium refresh. It's more than just a minor refresh. Maybe it's not quite as extensive as all new, but the changes are substantial and it translates directly into better driving feel in terms of better suspension and just the overall much improved experience inside this vehicle. And also just looking at it from outside, it's also improved. So I know that feedback cycle is working because they're taking this account and making changes so quickly. It's only been a few years since the original Outlander came out, and yet this thing has already received so many changes, so many good changes, and that's because of that feedback cycle. The ninth point is an interesting one, and it's very timely because it has something to do with the tariffs, which may come into effect depending on where you live. But because this thing is built in Japan, so far it has not been affected by potential tariffs that might happen between US, Canada, Mexico, and elsewhere. Right now, Japan is excluded. So at this point in time of making this video, there's no tariffs for Japanese cars coming from Japan. So that means Japan is kind of in a neutral stance, and that could be advantageous because if there are tariffs that will go on to Canadian cars or Mexican cars into US or vice versa, then the prices will go up. But thankfully, Japanese cars are not affected, and that could be an advantage. And also, I see Japan as a kind of neutral country in all the things that are happening in politics. And so far, anyway, Japan is kept out of that political tension. And therefore, for many of you guys who wants to buy a car under more of a neutral stance, well, Japan is an easy one to pick because they're not really involved in any of these political disagreements and issues with other countries, at least for now. And so you can buy a car from Japan and not get in trouble with your family or friends who might have some ideas as to what cars you should buy from which country. So I think they're a neutral partner right now, and that could be an advantage if you buy cars that are built in Japan. The 10th and the final thing I want to point out is the fact that regardless what I tell you, regardless of the data, there is a perceived value with cars engineered and built in Japan. A lot of you guys who watch my video really like cars that are built in Japan, are brought in from Japan, and that is kind of true in the marketplace. So if it's built in Japan, there tends to be a bit of a trust, and therefore resale value is higher, and it's also easier to sell cars down the road. And you know what, maybe it's not always the case that cars built in Japan are better, but people believe so, and that do impact resale value. And you can see it in numbers if you really have to see it and compare, let's say RAV4 Prime, which is built in Japan, versus RAV4 that's not built in Japan. And you'll see that there's some difference in terms of how people view it. And as you know, I sell and buy many cars. And when I tell people that this one is built in Japan at this factory, you know what? They say, oh, okay, it's built in Japan, it must be good. Again, it's a bit of a perceived value, and perception can be different based on who you're talking to, but it does translate to slightly higher resale value from my belief anyway. So that's the final reason why it could be advantageous to buy a car that's built in Japan, like this one, which is a Mitsubishi Outlander, refreshed for 2025. And I can tell you right now that this Mitsubishi Outlander for 2025 follows and meets all of those 10 things I talked about. Not just built in Japan, it's engineered in Japan, it uses a collaborative approach, they have so much attention to details, they follow the Kaizen method. All that stuff I talked about so far applies 100% to this vehicle, which is why Mitsubishi Outlander, as it stands now for 2025, is the #1 car I will recommend in this price range, because really nothing else comes this close in offering the refinement, driving engagement, and the feel of a much more expensive car. Even though this is actually super affordable and offers really good price, it feels like a car costing twice as much. In fact, I'm going to specifically say that I'm a little bit disappointed with the recent Toyota cars that are coming out, because their interior looks cheap and they're using hard plastics and so forth, and they don't quite feel the same way they used to 4 or 5 years ago or even before that. And that's why I liked some of the older Toyotas and the older Lexus models. But this one has that same kind of an older Japanese craftsmanship feel, because they paid so much attention to detail, and it really shows. The materials are amazing, engineer looks great, it drives really well, and so far the reliability has been also really good in this new generation Outlander. And on top of that, you have this remarkable, clever engineering behind the all-wheel drive system called the Super All-Wheel Drive Control, and it handles the transferable torque front and back, different from other car manufacturers, and gives you a better response, because Mitsubishi, of course, has been involved in rally racing for many years, and they know exactly what to do to make the car perform in a slippery conditions. So all that stuff, I think, is just a bonus on top of the fact that this Mitsubishi Outlander is built in Japan like a tank at a factory I've been to, and I trust that factory. And so, you know what, this is the SUV you should definitely buy in this price range. I hope you enjoyed my videos about the Outlander, and also talking about why there are many advantages to buying cars built in Japan. I would love to hear back from you about Japanese built cars, so please make some comments below, and also would appreciate if you can give me a thumbs up, and if you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, I would truly appreciate if you can. Until next video, I'm signing off for now. Thank you so much.